From 1471 onward, the Portuguese continued to arrive on the West African Guinea coast on the Atlantic side at the Gold Coast settlement, which they named Elmina, Portuguese word for mine, because of the gold they found there on the 19th January of 1482. This was also when Nana Kawani Anashe or Anash of Elmina granted the Portuguese, who were led by Don Diego, land to build the Elmina fort. So it was actually an Akan man or the Akan who granted the Portuguese the land to build the fort. It continues on to say, this will become not only the first real estate transaction between Africans and Europeans on African soil, but also one which was to have severe repercussions beyond Africa. Because as we know, this later went on to flourish or lead to the transatlantic slave trade. So far we've been learning about mainly or focusing on the Elmina note and how the Portuguese and these other European traders came into West Africa and was granted this land by the African rulers in this area. So let's get into that. And to do that, we're going to go to the Elmina note, myth and reality in Ashanti Dutch relations. All right. And we're going to start at the very top. It reads, one of the more perplexing issues in the history of Ashanti relations with the Europeans of the 19th century Gold Coast has been that of the origin of, and the significance of the so-called Elmina note, the pay document which authorized the Ashanti to collect 2 ounces of gold per month from the Dutch authorities at Elmina. Not only have modern historians of Ghana evidenced no small of conclusion of this matter, but during 1870/1871, the Ashanti, the British, and the Dutch also disagreed strongly over the political significance of the note, as the Dutch negotiated to cede their positions or possessions on the Gold Coast to the British. Failure to resolve these disagreements contributed significantly to the Ashanti decision to invade the British protected territories in 1873. This action in turn led to the British invasions of Ashanti in 1874, which most historians agree constitutes a critical watershed in Ashanti history. Clearly, the matter of the Elmina note is one of some historical and historiographical importance. An examination of the relevant Dutch, Danish, and British documents now make possible a resolution of the majority or the major questions concerning its origins and meanings. The debate between the Ashanti, the British, and the Dutch shows that in the latter 19th century, there was considerable agreement over certain issues. First, no one disputed that the Dutch had for some time past paid the Ashanti a stipend of 2 ounces per month or 24 ounces per year. All right, so there was no disputing that the Europeans actually did pay the Ashanti monthly or yearly to hold that fort on their land. Secondly, all parties agreed that the Dutch began to practice this early 18th century following the defeat of Dunkerque by Ashanti forces under Asitutu. As Ashanti Kofi Kakari put it in a letter to the English governor, the fort of the place Elmina have for time immemorially paid an annual tribute to my ancestors to present time by rights of arms when we conquered Etim, king of Dinkra. Again, the fort of the place of Elmina have from in time immemorially paid an annual tribute to my ancestors to the present time by right of arms when we conquered Etim, king of Dinkra. Continuing, Etim having purchased goods to the amount of 9,000 pounds from the Dutch and not paying for them before we conquered the team, the Dutch demanded of my father, Asi Tutu the First, to for the payment, who paid it in full, and the Dutch delivered the Elmina to him as his own. When asked by the English to respond to his claim, Dutch Governor C. Nactaglas did not dispute that his government had long paid the Ashanti, inciting tradition. he allowed that the practice begun, or he allowed that the practice begun when the king of Ashanti conquered the Dinkas, and the pay note came into his hands. What the Dutch governor rejected was the claim that such payment constituted tribute, as the Ashanti asserted. So the only thing the Dutch governor disagreed with this whole Elmina note was that it was a tribute, meaning that they just laid down to the Ashanti and was just paying them ransom to be there. He's basically saying that it was agreement between both of them, opposed to a tribute, right? Rather, in Nagtauga's view, the Kosked was a mere gift to promote the trade with the natives of the interior. So, in his view, there was a view, or there was a gift to promote the trade with the natives in the interior. There was, of course, more than European pride involved here, and the Dutch paid tribute to the Ashanti in respect of their occupation of the fort at Elmina. Then, by what right could they cede their forts to the British? Ultimately, as is well known, the Ashanti issued a certificate of apology, withdrawing his claim of the overlordship over Elmina. Though some historians dispute the document authenticity, but whatever the validity of the certificate, more on this below, it must be remembered that the Ashanti continued to object to the transfer of his allies, the people of the town of Amina, to the British. And during this specific time, the people of the town of Elmina would have been the Fon people who inhabited the coast. It continues on to say, indeed, a year after the secession took place, he ordered an army to the coast to assist the Elminas in attempting forcibly to eject the British from the old Dutch fort. Continuing, looking back on these events, the colonial generation of the Gold Coast historians A.B. Ellis, W.W. Claridge, and W.E.F. Ward tended to find merit in the arguments of Kofi Kari. As Claridge wrote, Dutch payments to Ashanti or Asante of a yearly stipend naturally implied an admission on part of the Dutch that the Ashantis had the right to the ground of which their castle stood. So to continue on, we're going to read from the book An Archaeology of Elmina. And we're going to start at the first highlighted sentence we see. It states, during the 17th century, slaves replaced gold as the primary export from the Gold Coast. All right, slaves replaced gold as the primary export from the Gold Coast. The timing, reason, and implications of the shift have been the subject of extensive scholarship. At the core of a variety of economic, social, and political transformations were the labor requirements of the emerging plantation system in the Americas. These developments had important consequences in West Africa. Prior to the 17th century, European coastal trade was essentially the same as that of the Trans Saharan and Indian Ocean systems, which had begun centuries earlier. The items involved consisted of many commodities and luxury items from which there was already a demand. African gold was exchanged for metal goods, coral shells, clothing, and beads. The volume of trade was dependent on European production and supply of capabilities, as well as African trade and distribution networks. Initially, African economies remained self sustained and largely functioned independently. The slave trade, however, increasingly immense the African economies that supplied the slaves in many instances throughout raiding. All right, let me read that again. The slave trade, however, increasingly diminished the African economies that supplied the slaves in many instances through raiding.